Welcome to Scribbled, a podcast with reviews and conversations about some of the most important topics in economics and in global affairs. My name is Krzysztof Mroczkowski. In this premiere episode, I am very grateful that we are talking with Dr. Andrea Lorenzo Capussela. Hi, Andrea.
Hello. Hello.
Andrea Capussela is a visiting fellow at the London School of Economics, and he is the author of, among other works, The Political Economy of Italy's Decline, a book that I think all civic-minded, curious people should welcome. And it is also getting into very interesting answers on how to get out of institutional political economic problems. So, Andrea, thank you once again. Let's kick off. Your book, I think, is very much a practical troubleshooting, problem-solving venture, much more specific about the problems than usual political science books on such topics. And I was wondering quite simply, how much your professional experience added to this approach. So my first question is, I guess, if you could say a little bit about your professional experience in different roles and what did you try to bring about in those places that you worked, and maybe how it influences your work, such as this book.
Yes, thank you. I spent some time in the private sector in Italy first, in finance mainly, law and finance. And then I moved to the field of development. I went to Kosovo, where I led for a few years the economics office of an office set up by the international community to supervise Kosovo, which became independent in 2008, and the West thought that it needed supervision. So my job really was to be the interlocutor of the Minister of Finance and Economy and to try to help the country, rather than adopt good policy, chiefly build its own institutions. And that was very interesting because, I mean, it allowed me to observe from very close how politics and economics interact in a modern society. A very small one and a very backward one, and a very peculiar one because there was the international actor playing. So it was not just the usual domestic actor of the political economy of a country. But from that position, even though in the end, frankly, I couldn't do very much, at least I did much less than what I should have done perhaps, and I hope to do, it was at least possible for me to see the country as though I was watching it through an X-ray in a way. I could see how the various interests interacted, how various social groups made pressure or not on political choices, how the effects were, and so on. And then I moved doing a very similar job in Moldova. But if you like, I was on the other side of the barricade, because there in Moldova, on behalf of the EU, I was the main advisor to the Minister of Economy, who was also Deputy Prime Minister. So I could see, if you like, the same problems from the viewpoint of a minister, who, and so I saw much more clearly what the political constraints often are to making the right economic choices or the right institutional choices. And that was not always very apparent to me in my previous incarnation as, if you like, external interlocutor to a Minister of Economy and Finance. In fact, the book I wrote about Italy is, in a way, I started thinking about it while I was writing a fairly similar book about Kosovo, which includes, of course, the role of the international community. But my book about Kosovo is really an attempt to describe the political economy of that country. And I could do it because I could see it firsthand, in a way. While writing it, of course, I was thinking about my own country. And as I used to write the Kosovo book, as I used theories which are common in the political economy of development, in the political economy of growth, I thought that the problems of my country, which in many ways are peculiar within the Eurozone, or at least within the main largest Western European economies, say France and Germany and Great Britain, Italy's problems seem to be fairly peculiar. And I wonder whether those theories, which are usually applied in the field of economic history or the political economy of development, whether those theories could cast some light on Italy's problems. So in many ways, if you like, my professional experience, especially there, but also my experience in Italy, because I could see in a way firsthand from a much more limited standpoint than later, but I could also see how the economy actually works in Italy. That experience, I think, yes, in a way helped me to stimulate thinking about this book, and also helped me in if you like, deciding a line for it.
Mhm. So you have this experience of seeing things on the micro level as a lawyer, as a corporate business person, then as a policy planner, but from the independent organization point of view, and then as actually a political advisor and seeing what sort of terrible constraints political systems often have. And this all converge together, I guess. And I was wondering because this is what's interesting in your book. You take all the existing knowledge from the political science, from economics, and you give full credit to the story that was told thus far about Italian stagnation and problems, but you take it further, and I think it's really interesting how you identify those gaps. But maybe let's first say a little bit about this story, the narratives thus far before your book about why is Italy stagnating, why it isn't growing as fast as it was previously. So what was the story thus far? What went wrong?
Well, the basic story by now is fairly well understood. It is clear that Italy has a productivity problem. Its public debt, for example, is really the effect of slowing growth, and slowing growth is really the effect of slowing productivity growth. This is fairly clear. The very proximate causes of the decline in productivity growth are also fairly clear. There is a long list of reasons, which is by now really well established, and you find it in all the literature, in all the recent literature about Italy. And that goes from the average size of firms, which is much smaller than in comparable countries, the average capitalization of firms, equally smaller, much more reliant on debt than on equity capital, management practices in firms, which are usually worse than in comparable economies. All this added to broader problems such as the inefficiency of the public administration, the weakness of the political system, slowness of the judicial system. All this can explain fairly well why Italian firms and the economy as a whole innovate less than comparable economies, and therefore generate much less productivity growth. This really is a problem, which is at the origin of Italy's unemployment problem, Italy's public finance problems, and now Italy's social cohesion and public discontent problem. If Italy were growing faster than it is, discontent would be much less, social cohesion would be greater, it would be simpler to solve the remaining problems, and so on. Now, the question is whether one can draw all that long list of factors that explains the slowing down of productivity, whether one can draw them to a unifying explanation, or a more or less unifying explanation. And here opinions vary very much. The one I prefer, because it is theoretically more convincing and empirically well grounded, draws the attention on institutional factors. Now, institutions, somewhat perplexingly, in economics literature, is really understood to mean rules. When we talk about institutions in economics, we are really talking about the rules of a game, of a society, of an economy, of a political system. So the argument in a way would be that the rules that governs Italy's economy and society more at large are less efficient than the rules found in other countries. Before I say why this explanation is both convincing and insufficient, maybe I'll say a couple of words about alternative explanations. One, there are several. I will begin with the more plausible ones and I'll go down to the less plausible ones. One is about the inefficiency of the public sector. This is, if you like, very much in line with a fairly liberal, I don't want to say neoliberal necessarily, but if you like, a liberal vision, which begins from the premise that the private sector is typically more efficient than the public sector. In Italy, the public sector is particularly inefficient and is fairly large. And so it follows that this is, in this view, this is the main reason why the economy is stagnating. The solution would be to reduce the public sector and expand the private sector. If, however, the institutional explanation is correct, which says that Italy's rules are less efficient than elsewhere, then if you like, the liberal / inefficient public sector explanation will not be sufficient. If the rules of society are not efficient, moving resources from the public sector to the private sector, where the rules are inefficient too, will not achieve very much. We will perhaps improve things, but not enough. Because if the problem of the rules is systemic, you would expect to find it both in the public and in the private sector. And indeed, Italy's firms are less efficient than firms in comparable economies. Two fairly widespread and much less plausible explanations are the euro on one hand and culture, if you like. The euro can be quickly said. I mean, people who say it's a fault of the euro forget that Italy's problems and the slowing down of productivity long predate the accession to the euro. The euro is not the cause of Italy's problems. It is true that precisely because Italy has those problems, the monetary regime of the euro doesn't make life easier. In many ways, it makes it more difficult. Here, people usually invoke the strictures imposed on fiscal policy by the monetary regime of the euro. But they forget, again, that the main stricture stems from the size of the public debt and from the equilibrium between the size of the public debt, long-term growth, and the average interest rate on the debt, let's say the cost of the debt. If these three variables go out of equilibrium, then you fear for the sustainability of Italy's debt. This is the main issue. Namely, markets will look at this equilibrium to decide whether or not they can trust Italy enough to continue lending to it. And if they don't trust it, they will stop lending. This is the real constraint, much more than the constraints stemming from the euro, which, by the way, have proved to be fairly flexible in the past, and especially quite recently with the pandemic. So this euro explanation should not, the arguments used by it are not to be dismissed, because it's true that there are problems. The architecture of the monetary union is, I think, unbalanced, and this creates problems, but this is not the explanation of Italy's problems. The last one is culture, and if you like, it is it's a kind of fatalistic explanation. It says, well, yes, Italy's rules are inefficient, chiefly because they're not observed frequently enough. In fact, they are breached too often. But this is because it is part of Italy's culture. It was always like this. Some people say, well, Italy's history, Italy is unified politically only since 1861. Before that, it was divided into many principalities, many of which were run by foreigners. Italians don't see the state as their own, so they don't have a sense of civic duty, a sense of public duty, a sense of belonging to a civic community, and therefore they don't have the same ethics of rules as other peoples. This, I think, is a very unconvincing explanation. If you like, it is a sort of deus ex machina, this culture explanation. It is true, on the other hand, that that there is, if you like, a vicious circle between the inefficiency of the rules, the level, the degree to which they are respected, and the culture of tolerance for breaching rules. Because if you regularly see rules being breached, you will start, even if you are very public spirited, you will start to be tempted to breach them yourself, and you will gradually grow more tolerant for those who breach them. So if you like, reality shapes culture and vice versa. But what I object to is the idea that culture is an independent cause of these problems. But if we go on, you will see that culture, in a way, must come into the
So,
nation.
I guess it's difficult to argue with what you said. Those interpretations have been either a little bit on the lazy side, or fatalistic, or just too descriptive. They more or less describe the problem rather than say what's the root cause, and how to solve it. So what, in your opinion, was missing from the story that you thought it's necessary to include to get the fuller picture?
Yes, I mean, the question that remains open really is why Italy's rules are inefficient, or in the parlance of political economists, why Italy's institutions are inefficient. Economists usually stop there, in a way, because of the boundaries between disciplines. Then you move more into politics or history to explain why a country is developing in a certain way or has stopped developing. However, you must be able to cross those boundaries. So I thought that one cannot be satisfied with the answer that institutions are inefficient or rules are inefficient, and has to try to understand why. Um, a fairly recent theory, but very, very convincing, by Douglas North and others, tries to do this, try to explain in theory, if you like, what are the origins of institutions. And this theory points one to, if you like, to the broader politico-economic equilibrium of a country, which can be understood as, if you like, the way in which power is distributed in society, power meaning economic, political, social, in backward countries also military power, if the state doesn't have monopoly on violence, and power to be understood quite simply as the ability of inducing others to do what they would not otherwise do, in pushing them to do what you want them to do and not what they want them to do. So this idea of the politico-economic equilibrium, or social order, you can call it, which really is the way in which power is distributed in a society and the degree to which power is limited or is contestable. This shapes the way in which rules are, because the rules that govern a society in a modern democracy are the product of collective choices, of collective decisions. Rules are laws, and laws are made in parliament by people who are elected or can be voted out if they write bad rules. Rules, however, are not just laws. They are also the way in which laws are actually applied, and that depends on the efficiency of the public administration, on the efficiency of the judicial system, which are also indirectly the product of collective choices, because they are the public administration and the judicial system are both governed by other rules, and they're organized by the public sector, by politicians ultimately. But the third element that shapes the way in which the rules that govern a society actually are, third, besides laws and the way they are applied, are also social norms. Uh, Again, I mean, Kosovo provides an easy example. In Kosovo's laws, corruption is prohibited. But I spoke to many people, and I even read a paper spoke to people who had been working in the field of assisting the reform of public procurement. And apparently there is the chief procurement officer in the municipal administration of the capital of Kosovo said that each procurement contract is tainted by corruptions since he remembers. So this is a country in which social norms tolerate corruption, laws proscribe corruption, but they are not applied. So when there is a clash between these three factors, one has to see which one prevails. In Kosovo, it is the social norm that prevails that allows corruption. So even though it is proscribed, it regularly happens. In Italy, things are different, but in Italy, the actual rules, if you like, are more distant from the written ones than you can see in France or in Germany. Here, if you like, this is where power comes into play, because if it is true that the inefficiency of rules is the main root of low growth and therefore low income for people, high unemployment, social problems, and so on, why could such a problem persist for so long in a democracy? Why doesn't the majority principle impose itself on whatever logics or social groups favor the persistence of inefficient rules? So if you like, we went from the question, why are institutions inefficient, why are rules inefficient, to the question of why doesn't the majority principle in a democracy manage to solve the problem?
I wanted to ask about one thing that may even further complicate this whole view, because Italy actually had a similar social order, sort of a little bit more traditional, influenced by big interests and some family relations, and the whole plethora of social reality. It was fairly similar after the World War II. But in spite of all that, Italy had enormous growth. I think the year I was born, 1987, I think Italy jumped over Britain and became the fourth largest economy in the world, if I'm not mistaken, for just a few years. So it did fairly well. And then it stopped, even though, as you said, it adopted incredible, great state-of-the-art institutional laws, norms, rules, but it stopped working. What was that?
Yes, you're right. It's very good to take a step back, because the institutional, rule-based explanation faces two obvious objections, the ones you mentioned. Italy had a so-called economic miracle, just like Germany. And you can look at it in many different ways. But from the perspective, if you take into account how low Italy was, Italy's economic miracle is even more admirable than Germany's. Only Japan did better, not much better, but did better than Italy in the first 3 and a half decades after the war. That the explanation is very simple, however. Um, each of these countries drew on what is called usually the advantage of backwardness. They could develop very fast because they simply had to import and adapt superior foreign technology, mainly coming from the US, like the technology of the Fordist factory, and then move capital and millions of workers into the sectors where those technologies could better be used. Italy really completed its industrialization in the 50s and 60s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. And the productivity gains were huge. Imagine, I mean, I don't know I forgot the numbers precisely, but a peasant living in the hills of the south of Italy, in Calabria, doing subsistence agriculture, moving to the modern factories in Turin, car factories of Fiat, for example, in the late 50s, would multiply his hourly productivity by a factor of 10, perhaps. And when you have millions of people doing that, you have a huge productivity growth. That doesn't really depend on how, if you like, all the talk about rules being important for growth and for productivity growth is much more valid for advanced economies. Economies that depend on high-end innovation, innovation at the frontier. Of course, all economies also import innovation that others develop, but in order to stay on the frontier, to stay, if you like, to remain together with the most advanced economies, they have to generate innovation themselves. And that requires the rule of law, so that, if you like, there is a level playing field between new innovators and old innovators. If you don't have that, for example, the electric engine would not have displaced the steam engine, or the train would not have displaced horse-drawn travel, because, you know, the monopolist of the horse-drawn travel would have stopped the inventor of the train. So you need the rule of law and you need competition in order to have markets open for new ideas. That is much less important while you are catching up with the advanced economies. So that explains why Italy's institutional problems were not a constraint to growth during the first 30 years, if you like, after the war, and why they gradually became a much more important constraint later, when Italy became a very advanced economy. At that stage, with a delay of perhaps a decade, Italy started changing its rules. I think there are various indexes of reforms, which they are worth because it's hard to translate that into a number. But Italy was one of the greatest reformers of the 90s and also early 2000s. But if the rule of law is weak, writing many good laws doesn't help you very much. Of course, it improves things, but not as much as it should. So, if you like, despite these objections, the institutional explanation holds. Because if you take a historical approach, you will see that when you were backward, that didn't matter much. It becomes important when Italy became advanced. And the institutional problem is, if you like, the rule of law problem is precisely the reason why the reforms written in the laws were not enough, didn't change reality enough to if you like, to change outcomes.
Mm-hmm. So the reality on the ground proved to be something different, and even though there was this huge reformist attempt in the 90s to have the state-of-the-art institutional setup, it didn't help much actual economy, actual institutions, the social order with its power relations, with its political economy, with the strong arming the weak prevailed. And I'm thinking about a little bit to give our listeners a little bit of an idea. How does it look on the ground? What sort of incentives we have in this social order such that it cannot be reformed or broken, why can't we just, not only improve how the law is written, but how it is executed, how everybody relates to it? Why is that? What is not working?
Yes. In fact, this reminds me that I forgot to answer one bit of your former question, which is very relevant now. In very simple terms, growth driven by innovation produces what is usually called creative destruction, which is what we mentioned before. Horse-drawn travel gets destroyed by the invention of the steam engine. But that is good for social welfare. It's bad for the monopolist of horse-drawn carriages. If that monopoly has enough power, he or she will stop the invention or the diffusion of the train. This tells us that typically it is established elites that are the product of the previous phases of development that have an interest in stopping creative destruction and therefore slowing down growth. But that is against the general interest. So the question is, how can they succeed? Before I answer that, I want to clarify, however, that I'm not referring to all of Italy's elites. If we define elites as the main companies, their owners, their managers, among them there are excellent companies that, despite Italy's systemic problems, succeed in world markets, beating also competitors established in much better governed countries. So they have to overcome even bigger problems. Now, these companies are genuine innovators. There are many, luckily, if you like, they hold Italy on their shoulders. These companies would benefit from improving things. So the elite is divided within itself as well. There is perhaps a relative majority of members of the elite that, by reason of, if you like, ingrained inefficiencies, have an interest in, if you like, keeping things as they are. And they apparently seem to prevail over the more innovating and enterprising segment of the elite. So the discussion about the elite is not as simple as it could seem. But if we put the elite aside, the question is, why isn't there more pressure from society for changing things? And one part of the answer is that throughout the 7 decades since the Second World War, and even before that, Italy's political elites have built a social welfare system that was not built according to a universalistic criterion. They didn't say, all right, we need to protect people from the risk of unemployment or from the risk of old age, so we will establish a universalistic pension system, a universalistic unemployment benefit system that will give to everyone in the same way, according to the same criterion, with maybe different levels for different people, depending on their conditions, but based on uniform criteria. No, they didn't do that. Similarly, in a way, to other Mediterranean countries or Southern European countries, the social welfare system was built that the one that we have today is the result of the sedimentation of a plethora of particularistic measures, like usually attributed to different professional categories. The best example is a past one. Until 1978, Italy did not have a national health system, but had a large number of health insurances for every different profession with public sector intervention. So doctors had one, artisans had another, retailers had another, and each were a bit different. And each was given at different times. Each was privileged in a way compared to the other ones and to the rest of society. And these small particularistic privileges created in the in the categories that benefited from them, it created an interest, if you like, not to rock the boat. It created a stake for them in the persistence of the social order, if you like, that gave them those privileges. To some extent, it aligned their interest, at least their short-term interest, with the interest of the elite, or rather of that segment of the elite that fears creative destruction and prefers to keep the rule of law weak, for example. And we still have this, for example. Italy to this day doesn't really have a universalistic unemployment protection system. There is one for large companies. There are other ones, more ad hoc ones, and now there is discussion, but until very recently there was nothing. So if you like, workers in large factories, because they had this protection that informal workers or workers in smaller factories didn't have, if you like, even they, despite being, I think, disadvantaged very heavily by the system, even they had a kind of interest in preserving the political-economic status quo.
That's interesting. So I was wondering how then this transfers into the problem where incentives are aligned in such a way on the micro level of micro actions by people, by companies, by bureaucrats, in different institutions, organizations, so that things are run in suboptimal, inefficient way in which this later is a block on Italy companies' competitiveness, innovativeness. How does it work on the ground?
Let's take one example. If you like, in the book I try to show that there are many vicious circles in Italy that can be, if you like, that together compose a kind of spiral that keeps Italy down. Let's make one example. I said earlier that if the first in the list of problems that traditionally are made to explain Italy's slow growth, there is the small average size of companies and their small capitalization, which explain their low growth and their low innovation, low expenditure in research and development, and so on. Why have companies low capitalization? Why don't they merge more? One large part of the answer has to do with rules. We have empirical evidence, to be taken with caution, but it's fairly clear. We have empirical evidence that Italian companies tend to follow the accounting rules less well than companies in comparable countries, Spain included, for instance. There is a large gap between Italy and its peer economies on the question as to whether companies' accounts are fully reliable and the accounting standards are properly complied with. We have the same gap between Italy and peer economies on the question whether the interests of minority shareholders in firms are properly protected. And the two problems contribute to and are an effect of the weakness of the rule of law. Now, if you are the owner of a firm and you live in an environment like Italy's, where accounting standards are not very well complied with, and the interests of minority shareholders are weakly protected, you will find problems in finding equity capital, because people will have doubts as to investing in your company because they don't really know whether the numbers you show them are true. They have a small doubt as to whether they are not true, or a bigger doubt than they would have in Germany or France. And they know that down the line, if they invest, they risk being given dividends smaller than they would deserve, because someone manages to capture those profits and secretly take them out of the company. This is a strong disincentive for this
So
is
to just give an example, so if I'm a CEO and I need a capital, preferably I would like to get it cheaper, and it would be better if I could get it through equity financing if somebody bought my stock. However, if people are distrustful, as I, as a majority shareholder and a CEO, would be in this relationship of principal and agent, where I actually favor my own interest much more, and I cannot be trusted in good faith, they're not going to lend me money, and I will remain smaller and less competitive. Is that it?
exactly, absolutely. Or let's put it this way: a system, an economy where accounting standards are properly followed and minority shareholders are well treated, is an economy where you typically have more capital available at better conditions than an economy where accounting standards are weakly followed and minority shareholders are weakly protected. So every single firm in Italy would benefit from moving from the second system to the first system. But why? And if they were all to start complying with the accounting standards better and to start treating minority shareholders better, the system would move from B to A. Why does it not happen? Because it's a collective action problem in a way. Who moves first? Because if you are in a B system, in a bad system, and you start complying with the accounting standard and you start treating minority shareholders well, then you will suffer, as your action alone will not change the system. You will both suffer the consequences of the system, and you will find yourself at a competitive disadvantage with your competitors, with your peers, who keep stealing from minority shareholders and keep making false accounts. So unless you are confident that a majority of the other firms will move to the better system, you will be disinclined to do it. And that's exactly what we see in Italy. It is a bad equilibrium. Firms, even though they know that they would benefit from living in a system where accounts are trustworthy, shareholders are well treated, capital is plentiful and relatively cheap, they cannot move to that system because they cannot all decide to do it together. And if you like, the incentives coming from the judicial system, because if you make false accounts, sometimes the police comes and says and asks questions. As the problem is systemic, however, these incentives are not sufficient to move. So we have met one first example of this bad equilibrium or vicious circle, and there are many other ones. And this is a very important one, because that explains why firms receive less equity capital and rely more on debt financing than other firms. This explains why they innovate less, why they grow less. This explains also why they remain small, why they don't merge with each other. A producer of tables and a producer of chairs could decide to merge their productions and reap economies of scale. But if the owners are two families, it will be hard for them to find an agreement on who runs a country, because whoever doesn't run it is at risk of being swindled. This explains, for example, why in Italy, where firms are typically family owned in a vast majority, just like in Germany, by the way, why in Italy firms usually, well, the management of firms in Italy, in the manufacturing sector, in 2/3 of the cases, is composed entirely of members of the owning family. In Germany, where the number of family-owned firms is similar in relative terms, that percentage is just 1/4. To repeat, in Italy, 66% more or less of family-owned firms have a management that is composed entirely of members of the family. In Germany, this proportion is only 1/4, 25%. And as talents are distributed randomly in a population, not all members of a family, of a firm-owning family, will have the skills to run the company. And that's why they are badly managed, why they don't grow, they don't innovate. This is a third, if you like, element. This is all these are vicious circles and are part of a bigger one, where Italian firms are at the center, that whose result is that on average, they are less efficient than French, German, British firms, Spanish firms also.
So we have a great economy that is stagnating now for decades, and we have this terrible problem where even if people want to behave ethically, they can be sure they will be punished for it, because even if I'm not cheating, I will be the only one who's not cheating. Everybody thinks I'm cheating anyway, and they will see even with cheating, I've got worse numbers than my competitors and so on. And you have those spirals throughout the economy. And I was thinking, because I want to delve deeper on the conclusions from your book in another episode, and to talk a little bit more about the implications. But maybe if you could quickly say what's your problem-solving approach when you see those sort of spirals of vicious cycles, this terrible collective action problem. How governments and policymakers and political scientists, how they approached this sort of problem thus far. How did they try? Did they recognize it at all, or only parts of it? How they tried to remedy it, and what is the draft of your proposed concluding solutions that I want to get into in the next episode?
Yes. Well, thus far, the attempt. I mean, Italy is declining since a quarter of a century. GDP per capita now is at about the level it was in 95. During the same quarter of the century, in Germany, France, and Spain, GDP per capita grew by some 25%. So we lost a lot of ground. Italy is now poor, much poorer than it was a few years ago. And the problem is huge. Now, the attempts to solve it have tended to be technocratic ones, on one hand, and very superficial ones, on the other hand. We had a combination of technocratic and political governments in the past quarter century. Technocratic ones usually during periods of acute crisis. The last one was led by Mario Monti between 2011 and 12 during the sovereign debt crisis. All these governments did useful things. They avoided things getting worse. Some they improved. But if the problem is a collective action one in various sectors, that will not be enough. If we go back to the literature on the collective action problem, you need, if you like, a way to coordinate the actions of people. So that goes through the question of what are their interests, what are their ideas, what can capture their ideas, how do they define their interests. Let's go back to the CEO of our company that has to decide whether to cook the books or not. What goes through in his mind, in her mind, for example. That depends on, one can imagine that a battle of ideas and a wide public discussion of the problems, which are not really much discussed in public opinion in Italy, but a wider discussion of these problems would make them clearer and maybe maybe that would allow a battle of ideas, as I said, to take place, to question exactly this: what are our interests? What are the interests of every single member of the society? Um, and how can a revision of their interests and of the way in which their interests are being pursued can help improving things. Now, this is, I think, impossible without some organization that performs the function that in the past used to be performed by political parties. If political parties are organizations that discuss ideas and take account of interest, collect demands from societies and ideas and coordinate them, well, that is necessary if we are to have a battle of ideas, and if we are to have the emergence of one or more. It's a pluralistic society, so one would want to have more visions of the future of Italy, visions that are credible enough to change expectations about how people will react, whether, for example, they will start cheating the rules or will start following them more. That, I think, is something that happens in the realm of ideas, and therefore in the realm of politics in the highest sense of the word.
Mm-hmm. So we came from the technocratic and literature scientific discussion to the realm of ideas, where actual the troubleshooting and problem solving approach has led us. Andrea, thank you so much. We're gonna have a follow-up discussion, and we will pick up from where we left here. So talk a little bit about those ideas and the book that you're working on right now, and also we have some further discussion on the problems with liberalism and how liberalism currently has some difficulty dealing with regulating capitalism. And we'll talk also about the problems with European Union and debt crises, debt mutualization. Do we have this Hamiltonian moment, or should we have at all any debt mutualization? All this and more in the follow-up discussions. For now, thanks everybody for watching, and thank you once more, Andrea, and good evening. Goodbye.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.